we need to get out of there. This doesn't involve us. Our troops are sitting ducks, and we can't explain to the American people why we're there. If we can't do that, we need to get
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Kelley Vlahos, welcome to the Signal Sitdown. I'm so glad to have you on. I think it's such an important week to have you on the show, because the world is in chaos. We've known this for quite some time, but with the fall of the Assad government and escalation continuing apace in Ukraine, I think it's important to remind folks who are watching American politics, remind America of its proper role in these fights, and sometimes that's no role at all. It's interesting to see the kind of culmination of the late neoconservative dominance of American politics materialize through a war in Ukraine that's escalating, that really started with Maidan in 2014, and the fall of the Assad government in Syria, which started with the Arab Spring around that same period of time. You've been watching these countries, these little-known countries, for a really long time as a political journalist, as an observer. Tell our audience what you do right now and how you got there.
Okay, well, I'm the editorial director and editor of Responsible Statecraft, which is the foreign policy magazine of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is an action tank, meaning like we do advocacy as well as research and communications and strategy, trying to re-engineer U.S. foreign policy towards a diplomatic approach and away from a more militaristic, interventionist approach, which we feel has been sort of like consensus thinking in Washington for the last 50 years, and it's not working. And we can talk a lot more about that, because you mentioned some of the current conflicts, but we can trace a lot of the current conflicts and the chaos back to Washington policy, Washington thinking, all the way back to post-Vietnam years. And we, as an institute, feel like we are taking up the challenge of, I guess, confronting the institutional orthodoxies of Washington, which have all been surrounded or evolve around going to war as a sort of first tool in the toolbox when we have security, strategic issues overseas, as opposed to diplomatic approaches. And so I'm excited because we're one of the few people in Washington who are actually thinking in that way and putting money and energy and time behind it. And it's not easy. You have an entire military industrial complex that has evolved since Dwight Eisenhower's day. And basically, like I said, it is all geared towards keeping us at a war footing. Mm-hmm. And it's not benefiting the American people. You ask anybody on the street, they don't want to go to war. They don't want to send their sons and daughters to war. They feel stretched. They feel exhausted. They feel like their tax dollars aren't paying for what they need at home, and they're seeing it slushing over to Ukraine and other places in the world. And this all goes back to bad policies. And so my job is to edit a magazine in which we bring in these voices of restraint and realism, which is key, on issues spanning the Middle East, Ukraine, Latin America, the lobbying in D.C. and the politics in D.C. And so it's a kind of an exciting job. I had worked in conservative news for the last 20 years of my career, starting with Fox News. I was a political journalist and web reporter for them since 2000. So I was there during 9/11 and all the coverage of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. and started writing for the American Conservative in 2007 because I felt I wanted to get more involved in critiquing the Iraq War policy, the situation in which a lot of our tax dollars were proliferating, the contracting, private contractors and security, and the harms and risks that we were putting our men and women overseas. And the American Conservative was the only conservative voice in Washington at the time that had actually been skeptical of the rush to go to war in Iraq and had taken a lot of slings and arrows for it. It was started by Pat Buchanan. As you know, you worked there yourself. But it was one of the few places where I felt that I could go as a journalist who had been at Fox News and in a conservative outlet to get more involved in journalism with a point of view. And that point of view was really shedding some light on what our policies were, how the neoconservative strategy had gotten us into this war, and trying to get us out, and sort of creating I don't want to say an atmosphere of dissent around the war. A lot of it was coming from the left at the time, but not so much from conservatives, except for the American Conservative. So I worked there for many years, and found, a real community of people who later became, I guess, as Donald Trump burst out on the scene in 2016, criticizing the war in Iraq and foreign, no more foreign, forever wars and regime change wars. And it seemed to really blow up in 2016. So people now they recognize that conservatives, MAGA, the Trump base, whatever you want to call populists, are some of the most skeptical of U.S. foreign policy abroad and interventionism, but it wasn't quite so popular on the right to think in those ways back in the 2000s. So I'm glad to see that. And what Quincy does is we harness all that energy on the right and all the energy on the left and try to bring it together, because it's obvious to us and our founders that without the left-right buy-in, that we're never going to change the foreign policy in this town, because it is a bipartisan war party in Washington. And, you can take it right up to the committees and the leadership on the Democrats and the Republican side. And so without having a collaborative venture in terms of like bringing the conservatives and liberals together, it's not always easy, but you got to do it. And I think the American people like it because they like this, what we call partisanship, because they're A, tired of the partisanship, and B, they recognize that this isn't like a left-right issue. It's an issue that spans both sides, and it's also anti-authoritarian. It's skeptical of U.S. power, skeptical of elite control, the idea that the American people have had a loss of connection to Washington specifically on when it chooses to go to war and use our men and women to go to war. And so, so that's an exciting aspect of Quincy, that it's not just a partisan venture. It actually takes both sides into account, and that's good for me, because I've worked on both sides of the aisle myself. In a lot of my journalism jobs, I just have happened to be at conservative outlets for the last couple decades throughout all of the forever wars.
Yeah, and it's in order to challenge the war party, you need an anti-war party, and you're only going to do that by bringing together voices on the right and left who, regardless of how they think about domestic political issues, are thinking similarly about the legislature's role and the executive's role, and how the awesome powers vested into the American government ought to be used for the advancement of the American people's interests and not the advancement of some faraway country. You mentioned you started writing for the American Conservative in 2007. You were kind of seeing that publication blow up in real time. I spent time at the American Conservative, as you know. That's how actually we became friends. And I was only 3 years old when 9/11 happened. And so I played kind of catch up on on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I remember flashpoints, right? I remember the surge. I remember watching on TV actually as a very young, toddler, like the scenes from Baghdad when Saddam Hussein was being toppled.
Yeah.
Like those are like really crystallized moments in my mind, like watching the statues fall, etc. And, I saw Trump come to the political fore daring to say that the Iraq war was a mistake in a Republican Party that had just doubled, even tripled down on that vision of American foreign policy, not only in the Bush years, but with the nomination of John McCain and also the nomination of Barack Obama, or of Mitt Romney in the Obama years. And when those two candidates flopped and Trump came on the scene, I said, hold on, I was told by all these smart people in all these smart editorial boards at the Wall Street Journal and National Review and insert whatever mainstream conservative publication here, I was told that the war on terror was justified and good, and that our time in Iraq and Afghanistan, those were taxpayer dollars well spent. And when the scales kind of fell from my eyes and I realized that everything I had been told, especially from the institutional right, was a lie, I went looking for a publication that was right from the beginning, and that was the American Conservative. And so I bought all of Pat Buchanan's books as quickly as I could before I'm sure, Joe Biden would have them, blacklisted and banned from the public square, and got to reading those. But in your case, you saw this unfolding in real time and your positions kind of evolved as the political situations evolved. What was that watershed moment for you when you realized that these wars in the Middle East were a mistake?
Oh boy, that's a great question, only because I have always been skeptical of the use of military force as a cudgel for U.S. foreign policy. And that begins with my interest in learning more about Vietnam when I was a little girl. So when I was little, that's the war the first impressions of war that I had. I grew up in a working class town in Bristol, Connecticut. Tons of Vietnam veterans, memorials, stories, family, friends of family. My dad was in the National Guard. So I was pretty much absorbed in Vietnam. And the lessons I took were that there was something very wrong and that the American people were lied to about that war, why we were there, the success of it as time went on. As body bags were coming home, and then the veterans having to deal with PTSD and Agent Orange when they got back. And that's how I sort of came to my own recognition about foreign policy and the government's role in war. And that continued into my high school and college years when the Persian Gulf War happened in 1990. And what happened there is I found that I was one of the few people that was actually skeptical of that war. And so I've always had that bone in my body. And I have to say, as a young journalist, watching veterans come home from that war and then being complaining of undefined, ill-defined symptoms that they were having, and they later called the Gulf War illness. I had flashbacks to what was going on, 20 years earlier with the Vietnam veterans coming home and wanting to be recognized for the symptoms that they were suffering from Agent Orange. And so I saw history repeating itself, but I also saw that there was this blob in Washington that wanted to forget all of the lessons that were learned, like they didn't happen. This creation of narratives, everything would be resolved if we go to war and we confront the enemy, Saddam Hussein, and neocons wanted to go further and take him out of Baghdad, and H.W. Bush had said no. But it was all about narrative building and the stories that we tell us about why we were doing the right thing and democracy and freedom. And we're constantly drawing from the well of World War II, because nobody was drawing from the well of Vietnam. Everybody wanted to forget Vietnam. So there was constant reaching back about how we were the indispensable nation. And it was basically our obligation to fight for freedom for other people across the globe. And all of that sounded very false to me after witnessing as a young girl what happened in Vietnam and knowing that that was all a farce in terms of those stories that the people told themselves at that point. So I think by the time I was working at Fox and 9/11 happened, I remember when it happened and I was all in support of us doing something to retaliate for the loss of Americans that day in New York. So I was not one of those people right after the bat who didn't want to raise a flag or not have a spirit of.
You were not concerned about Islamophobia immediately.
No, I honestly was as shocked as anybody else. Mm-hmm. And I actually did believe that President Bush in those very early days was doing the right thing in terms of mobilizing the country, which that first and foremost needed to happen. We all had to stand together in unity. And for a crystallizing moment that actually happened until all the politics seeped in. I guess it was when the legislative push, the political push for war started to get making me a little bit nervous. Okay, let's go after Al-Qaeda. Let's go after the people who actually caused this. I had no problem with that going into Afghanistan. But because I watch the news, I'm a reporter, I was watching the daily, the headlines and the CIA over there and the special forces. And then I felt like a mission creep was starting to come upon the scene. And I didn't like the fact that we were picking up people off the battlefield and putting them at Gitmo. And a lot of them were, they were getting picked up because, say, somebody who didn't like them were pointing fingers, and there was these huge drag nets, and the pictures were coming back from Gitmo, and I started feeling like the forces in Washington that always want more, the mission creep, the sense of we got to do something and it doesn't matter, let's just do it and then don't ask questions, deal with it later. I felt like that was starting to really snowball in Washington. And I think that moment that you asked me about was probably when they passed the Patriot Act, because that became more of a domestic response. And that made me really nervous because I'm thinking, okay, so we're going to be punished for something that these Saudi operatives who came here and killed our American citizens, and all of a sudden we're all suspect. And I remember there were a few Democrats, but then Ron Paul was probably the only one. There was a congressman named, I think it was Bob Barr. I was a Southern congressman, a libertarian, and that was about it. And, I was working at Fox at the time, so I made sure when I was doing my stories, I said, okay, well, let's get Ron Paul in here. Let's get Bob Barr in here. Let's get both sides of the story on the Republican end, because the vast majority of Republicans were like, whatever it takes, expand those federal law enforcement authorities, expand the spying, expand the ability for warrants and wiretapping and everything. And that's when the libertarian inside of me was just like, there is something really wrong here. Mm-hmm. And yeah, Ron Paul, again, as salient as ever, came out and he didn't care that he was going to get whiplashed by his party. And he was absolutely right, because it wasn't just about the fact in that moment whether or not we needed these authorities to go after terrorists. Mm-hmm. It was seeing 1 year, 5 years, 10 years in the future and how these authorities were going to be abused. And damn it, they were abused. Yeah. And we can go down the line of all the reports that have come out since then about the FBI abusing the powers of spying on Americans. And so I think that was when I really started to get agitated and saw that this was going to be your typical Washington war, in which they were going to do as much as they possibly could without really informing the American people. And then once you get into that mindset, you can't go back. And so you watch the press conferences, you watch the Pentagon briefings, you match what's happening, you can find out what's happening in the field with what they're saying in the briefings, and you realize that there's this disconnect. You watch how the media was being manipulated. They were sending embeds over. There was going to be no chances for any independent journalist to go over there and try to report what was happening. You had to be certified and embedded with a unit via the Pentagon, and they could say no to anybody. So you had, guess who's over there? All the mainstream media, hardly any independent media. You're embedded with a unit. You become very friendly with that unit. You have to watch how you're writing, what you're writing. And, this is all borne out, by many journalists who are over there, which really resulted in a highly choreographed, very crafted, I want to say self-censored narrative about the U.S. war policy, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, by the time they had the push to go to Iraq, I feel like I was already in the mode of hardcore critiquing, and that's about the time that the American Conservative launched, was in 2002, because Pat Buchanan and others wanted to try to have a backstop against this neoconservative push to get us in the war. They couldn't stop us from getting in the war, but the American Conservative was there right off the bat to test them and check them at every move. And then, yes, it turned out no WMDs. It turned out there was a ton of manipulation in terms of the arguments that got us into war. And it wasn't, like you said, it was, Ron Paul, I give Trump a lot of credit for opening up dissent about the Iraq war when he ran in 2016. But Ron Paul was out there from the beginning when he ran for president twice. And the Republican Party lambasted him like you wouldn't believe. I remember this one speech, I believe it was at the 2004 Republican National Convention in New York City, which I covered. And this was like a major rah-rah convention because it's New York City. It's only 3 years after 9/11. And
Giuliani's at the peak of his powers.
Giuliani is at the peak of his powers. And here's Ron Paul saying, listen, we're not going to stop terrorism. We're actually creating new terrorism by bombing all of these countries. And it's going to blow back on us. And Rudy Giuliani pointed his finger and he said, you apologize. That's un-American. And I am not going to leave this stage until you apologize. And Ron Paul's like, whatever. Because they couldn't believe that somebody could speak out. They call that kind of talk unpatriotic, un-American. And guess what? It wasn't but 10 years later that Donald Trump stood up on a debate stage and he said the same thing. Yeah. And he said it was all built on a lie. And his fellow Republicans, they were aghast. And some of us probably thought, oh, geez, this is going to really tank him in the polls the next morning. And actually, his numbers went up because he was saying what everybody was feeling. It's just that at that point, I don't think Republicans had the sort of license to really vocalize how they felt about the war because the party itself, like the institution that you mentioned, had sort of enforced this sort of narrative that you had to think a certain way about the military, about how it is used, about the wars. And if you dissented or you criticized somehow that you weren't patriotic, you weren't a good team member. And I think Trump's like, well, not only is the institutional party crap, but this whole idea that we have to keep supporting a failing war is crap too. And everybody's like, phew.
Yeah. and it's so obvious. I was very young when all of this was happening in real time, but it's so obvious for those of us on the right to retrospectively draw the line between the start of the wars on terror, then into the Great Recession, then into the Tea Party, and into the momentum that Ron Paul developed over the course of that campaign, then with the VA scandal, and then culminating in this once-in-a-lifetime figure in American politics, Donald J. Trump, right? Who has accomplished what only Grover Cleveland before him had accomplished. The man who took on Tammany Hall, right? I mean, Grover Cleveland in power for 4 years, out of power, comes back. Trump, same thing. He's back. He's going to be back in power come January of 2025. And I mean, he has a impeccable record on foreign policy in terms of the deliverables that he promised on the campaign trail. He did not promise us restraint-oriented conservatives that he'd always appoint the best people and that he would be picking always our preferred, let's not say preferred sides in different conflicts, but he would be approaching the conflict in the exact same way as we would prefer him to approach the conflict. But what he did promise was wrapping up some wars, not starting any new wars, and destroying the ISIS caliphate. And those, I think, were three promises that everyone in restraint and realism worlds could get behind. He delivered mostly on those things. He's going to inherit a much more unstable world than he left Joe Biden, because now we have Syria's government has collapsed. The war in Ukraine continues apace. And of course, there's always fears of a confrontation between Iran and Israel. At the same time, we've been promised for a long time that we are going to pivot to the Pacific. I've been promised that this pivot is just going to be a postural pivot, that it is not going to mean that we're going to fight with boots on the ground in Taiwan. I don't know if I can believe all of the folks who tell me that quite yet. But nevertheless, you're looking at 3, 4, if you want to break it down even further, areas in the world where there could be very quickly hot conflicts where the United States is deeply involved. One thing that you said in your introduction and in your background was your role at Responsible Statecraft is to reassert diplomacy. And before we dive into these specific issues, I want you to talk about how the military-industrial complex and the Department of Defense has swallowed up the diplomatic capacity of both the legislature and the State Department.
Well, I mean, I can tell you exactly when that happened, and that was during the Iraq War. So I was covering, obviously, that war and the budgets that were passed every year. And the State Department budget was going like this, and the Pentagon budget was going up like that. So just at that level of the resources. And when you put resources into something in this town, that's a signal for everything else. So if the State Department is getting less every year and the Pentagon is getting more, that's a signal that all of our faith and commitment is with the Pentagon on the war front, and that the State Department's going to take a back seat role. And that's exactly what happened. The Pentagon was not only tasked with fighting a war and deposing Saddam Hussein and dealing with the insurgencies that unfolded after, they were responsible for the nation building. And that's a huge word, which entails not only the actual securing of these local communities, but dealing with the negotiations and the collaborations with local leaders, with reestablishing basic services like the local economy, the justice, the education, the healthcare. I mean, you're probably thinking right now, well, why was the Pentagon in charge of that? That's how weird it was during this Iraq War period, that the American people were just supposed to be accepting of the idea that the military was a government in a box. And they would tell you, oh, no, Kelley, the State Department was fully engaged. Well, they were fully engaged where the Pentagon allowed them to be engaged. And you had the State Department come in with the coalition provisional government in Iraq, and they would have a big pot of money, and they were able to do these little programs. And guess what? Those programs were corrupted like everything else. And they built up things, and they had little classes, and just like you saw in Afghanistan so many years later, we prop up these local communities, and then the minute we left, they would just disintegrate because we didn't really build anything. We were just, we're sort of like creating a dependency.
The American dollar convinced a lot of people to engage in this quote unquote community
Right.
until the American dollar left the scene.
Right.
And then there was no incentive for these people to actually coalesce with one another. Right?
And honestly, I think that if the State Department, and I'm just saying this as a theory, I don't know, because they got a lot of their own issues. But if the State Department had been put fully in charge, maybe they would have found ways to build long-lasting, sustainable projects that they could hand over to those communities and that they would actually be maintained. I think that there was just this little house of cards built up that the Pentagon was ultimately in charge of. And guess what? The military doesn't know how to teach children and take care of mental health issues in a wartime environment. They're trained to fight and kill. And next thing you know, they're being asked to do an entire nation building exercise. Yeah. And so I feel like the State Department started losing the muscle memory and the ability and the faith and the commitment to do the real things that they're supposed to be doing. And that was diplomacy. And on the other end, they sort of took their cues from the Department of Defense, and they became more of an appendage of the military. So you look at it now, you said, okay, Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, what kind of actual diplomacy have you been doing in Ukraine? When we see him talk, is he saying anything different than, say, the Secretary of Defense is? Everything is couched in military terms. They're couched in terms of how many weapons we're giving, how Russia should kowtow to what we're saying they should do. They're sort of working in tandem with NATO and at their press conferences. I don't see and hear a lot of the diplomacy that was so, I would say, so pivotal and superior back during the Cold War days, where diplomats were diplomats. They did their job. They spent their whole year long shuttling back and forth and engaging in really tough negotiation with other leaders. I feel like because of the Iraq War situation, we've just brought the State Department in as just another agency within this military industrial complex. They've lost the ability, and you see this not only in Ukraine, but you've seen this in the Middle East over the last year. I don't see a lot of toughness coming from the State Department. I see a lot of mealy-mouthed, we're doing our best and we're using tough words and we're condemning this, but I just don't see the days of Kissinger, so to speak, and some of the other greats of our past in terms of being separate, but part of the American enterprise and statecraft.
Yeah, and I want Lloyd Austin to be a big stick, and I want Antony Blinken to be a nice little carrot. And the same can apply to President Trump's nominees. President Trump, I think, understands this at a visceral, instinctual level, right? I need someone with a big stick. I need someone with a carrot. And even if that means at some points where our diplomatic messaging is a little bit incongruent to what the Defense Department is saying, right? The hidden, between the lines, which you should read if you're an adversary or a friend of the United States, is this is what the American population or the American nation is willing to do to defend itself. But this is actually the outreached hand, which is in the State Department. And we want to work with the State Department so that any sort of big threat eventuality doesn't happen. I'd rather have that type of contradiction than everything be smashed together and swallowed up by a massive Pentagon.
Right.
And Trump, through his picks, has basically chosen that route. Pete Hegseth, you said it earlier, right? What is the Pentagon good at? What should it be doing? It should be good at killing our enemies, if need be. And it should be a lethal fighting force. And you've heard Pete Hegseth talk about this a lot, right? All this other fluff is going to go away. I'm going to focus on making America the best military ever. And on the other hand, you have Marco Rubio, who has, I think, in some is in some ways more hawkish than I would prefer, particularly on the China issue. I don't think him and I see necessarily eye to eye on that, but he's someone who I think is going to be more assertive of the State Department's capacity, separate from the Defense Department's capacity. Are you encouraged by a potential dynamic between Hegseth and Marco Rubio on that front?
I guess I'd probably take a little bit more of a dissenting view. I don't believe that Marco Rubio has really changed his neoconservative spots. So I'm of the mind that I want to see how it plays out. If he's confirmed and he's in this role, will he take more on this idea of realism and America first restraint? He seems to have imbued some of the language post 2016 in terms of America first restraint, but the way he talks about Iran, the way he talks about Israel, he spent the vast, majority of his time in Congress being very hawkish. So far be it for me to not, give him a chance, but I'm a little concerned.
You and I share similar concerns about Rubio on a policy front, but I would much rather have Rubio advocating for the State Department's self-interest, right? Like trying to claw back some of that power from the Pentagon. And if Hegseth is willing to give that over to the State Department, I think that ultimately works for some diplomatic solutions
unless he
down
wants
the line.
to claw back that power to be more militaristic. So does he want to claw back the power so the State Department can again become a diplomatic force? Or does he just want it to be another military tool in the toolbox under a different agency for which he'll have control over? I don't know. And as far as Hegseth goes, I feel like he too has sort of changed the way he's talked about war and the use of the military. And he shows very much concern for the men and women that we're sending over there. We want to send them over for the right reasons and not for just Washington politics. And so I agree with that. And I'm glad that he's vocalized that. I just remember when I was covering the Iraq War, when he came on to the scene, it was heading a veterans group that wanted to see more troops surged into Iraq and Afghanistan. And he was very hawkish, as opposed to some veterans that had come back from the war, like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, some years later, who came back after her experience and actually wanted to see more restraint and fewer troops sent overseas. Maybe, and obviously everybody grows and matures and they see things differently as the wars wore on. And so far be it for me to second guess his transformation. I want to see some of these people in the Trump administration carry over their idea of restraint beyond Ukraine. Because it seems like Ukraine has unified a lot of Republicans or animated them and taking this restraint position and saying, hey, this isn't in the best interest of Americans to keep sending billions of dollars and fueling this war that obviously can't be won on the battlefield. We need to get to a negotiated peace. And this has enjoined a lot of conservatives, Heritage as well. And that's great. I just want to see if this is a principled stand that has roots in realism and restraint that goes beyond just this particular conflict.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about Ukraine specifically. Seems like we're on the brink of potentially World War III if escalation continues in Ukraine. And now we have Syria, which is a sandbox where all of those same players are involved. Previously, the Russian government warned the United States as it was aiding Ukraine that if it let Ukraine use ATACMS to strike Russian territory, that would be a massive red line and there would be a massive response. Biden, what's left of Joe Biden, allowed the Ukrainians to use ATACMS to hit Russian territory. And in response, Russia launched a new experimental hypersonic missile into Ukrainian territory, which Zelensky called very escalatory. I struggle to come to grips with the fact that we do have a president right now. His name is Donald Trump, but he has none of the powers of the presidency because he's not in office yet. We saw this with his trip to Notre Dame, meeting with all those world leaders. I mean, that is Donald Trump right now is not in office, and he is the leader of the United States of America. And we have a president who's completely MIA. We haven't had a president since he dropped out of the presidential race, it feels like. And nevertheless, this lame duck presidency is hurtling us towards a war in which our diplomatic options are becoming fewer and fewer.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I see these,
Sigh.
and this is this just to kind of put this in context. I see what we're seeing in Syria today as a direct result of what the neoconservative Republicans and their supporters in Washington set into motion after 9/11. You can the dot right on like ISIS, HTS, Assad. I mean, this is just a continuation of the 9/11 wars. In Ukraine, I see that as a direct result of Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland and the Democrats with their supporters like John McCain in Washington.
Motivated by the same neoliberal, neoliberal economics, neoconservative foreign policy. Yeah.
To overthrow Russia's influence in Ukraine. And so we're seeing the outgrowth of that. And so it's very interesting because I don't put Trump in either camp. And so he's in this real interesting position right now where he could be a game changer if he just does the right thing and has the right advice and the right people around him, that he could thread this and try to direct and to reconstruct our foreign policy and both theaters. It sounds impossible, but I think with the Ukraine situation, there's a clearer pathway to that, because he has said, I'm going in there and I want to end this war. And he is in very clear terms has said, this is not going to be won on the battlefield, and I want to bring the people, both sides together. We're going to do this. And he's already spoken with the Russians. I'm not sure if he spoke with Putin. Has there been some question about what they are actually have they,
or whether or not he's spoken to Lavrov?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But he did speak with Zelensky, as you pointed out, in Paris with Emmanuel Macron, president of France, who's not doing very good these days, at Notre Dame. But he's already established himself and his position. And Zelensky, you can see, is already altering how he's talking about this. And, and Trump has put the European partners on notice about where the United States stands. So I can see, and he never wanted to go to war in the first place. And I feel like the Democrats push this. And we can have a whole other conversation about NATO and NATO expansion and Russiagate and how everything sort of led to this moment. I feel like Trump, again, is in the better position to end it. On the Middle East, that's a little bit more of a sticky wicket.
So while we're on the Ukraine front, before we pivot, let me try to organize my thoughts here. Donald Trump wins on November 5th. I believe it was November 6th that Zelensky came out with a tweet congratulating Donald Trump on his victory. And then I think the exact words were in the tweet, seeking a just peace. Like
something like that.
That was like the first time where it was like, oh, like Zelensky actually gets the message.
Yes, he gets
after
the message.
all of this, after the visits to Congress and asking for money and going to European allies, asking for troops, all of that stuff, Trump gets elected, and Zelensky understands that he ultimately is a patron of the United States at this point. The government of Ukraine would have been bankrupt 5 minutes into this conflict had it not been for the entire U.S. government propping up those various governmental entities in Ukraine. Then all of a sudden, it appears that the Biden administration lets Ukraine use ATACMS on Russian territory to undercut the incoming Trump administration, whereas Zelensky seemed
seem to recognize the reality that the jig is up, that the war is going to come to an end, that he's going to have to negotiate with the Russians. And Biden then ensures the perpetuation of the conflict over what Zelensky seems to believe is the most likely outcome, which is a negotiated peace. And I guess my question on that front is, what does the Biden administration, what does the blob that controls the Biden administration hope to gain by the continuation of this war, whereas Zelensky signaled that he could be ready for a peace?
I think there's so many things going on here. I mean, one is just this Russia hate. I mean, there is just a very palpable energy of opposition to Putin. And once you set into motion this idea that Putin is Hitler, that if Putin is not held in check, if he's not overthrown, if he's not thrown out of Russia, Ukraine proper, that somehow he is going to be unleashed, that he'll be rampaging across Europe within weeks. It's hard to claw that back. Mm-hmm. So I think you have a situation here where you have Biden, and it's not just Biden, it is all of these European capitals are hell-bent on continuing this war and under the rubric of NATO. And so I think as much as Trump has a lot of authority right now and has basically put on notice where we stand, and Zelensky does recognize that, I think there is a serious fight ahead, because NATO is not going to give up its influence or its role in this. And you want to talk about a blob. We have a blob here in Washington. You have a blob there in Brussels. This huge administrative bureaucracy that has been built up over the last 40 years that is called the NATO alliance. And they're not about to sort of retrench because Donald Trump says they got to end the war. So there's going to be some tough times ahead where they have already set into motion a number of loans to Ukraine so that they can continue the war after Biden leaves, which is putting Ukraine further into debt. So this is the EU, this is NATO. They're giving them stuff like it's a fire sale, just like Biden is doing the same here in Washington. We just gave $750 million more in weapons that are coming out of our stockpiles, by the way, because they're afraid that Trump is going to shut the spigot off. And so Europe is doing it too. I think Zelensky is kind of playing both ends here, because if you look at what he's saying, on one hand, he's like, oh, I want a negotiated peace. I understand, I'm going to work with Trump. And then the other side of his mouth, he's still asking to be a NATO member. Right. And he
just asked for foreign troops on the ground in Ukraine not 2 days ago.
Exactly. Yeah. And more weapons, and the ability to use them even deeper than the ones. UK has allowed their Storm Shadow missiles to be used in Russia. We're letting them use our weapons. Germans are still holding back, but they're still. Zelensky's not stupid. He knows that he's got to work both ends, and so I think maybe if this was like a tennis match, maybe Trump has won the first round by just winning the election and throwing the gauntlet down. But I do think it's going to be tough to convince NATO to get to the table. Yeah. There's just too much invested. And like I said, once you make your adversary the devil, it's hard to say, well, let's sit down and talk with the devil. And, that's something that Biden and NATO did to themselves by making this an existential crisis. And the future of democracy of the whole entire world at stake. Okay, well, now we got to talk. So
yeah. So Zelensky is speaking out of both sides of his mouth. I think that is true. Point being, with his tweet after the election, right? Like, that was the most positive sign that I'd seen from Zelensky.
And he said many things since then.
And he said many things since then. And I guess if you're looking at it from, like, let's say, like, the NATO perspective, where, like, NATO is functionally like two camps. It's the American neoconservative / neoliberal, we must continue American hegemony
throughout all time, and we have to stay in NATO because we have to control the world, blah, 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 blah. All this globalist nonsense that we've heard over the past 30 years in American foreign policy. There's the American primatists, and then there's the other side, which is the European free riders. And I think those two are working in concert to perpetuate this conflict because they don't think, they for some reason think that the continuation of this conflict will ensure, will be a backstop to multipolarity in Europe and across the Atlantic, in the United States. And so you have people like Macron who like oscillates wildly in my mind when it comes to his opinions on the Ukraine war. And I don't know if it like Macron's kind of whole political MO is like issue du jour already. So it's difficult for me to read the tea leaves on what he's actually saying with Ukraine. But the real scary one for me is Merz in Germany, saying that we don't want Ukraine to fight with one hand tied behind its back any longer. Zelensky recently just updated the casualties where he said 43,000 Ukrainian soldiers had died in Ukraine up until this point. That number I tend to believe is complete baloney because in February 23, the United States government were already estimating the Ukrainian that 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers had already been killed. Like now, you know, you're going to have some European countries popping out like whack-a-mole for President Donald Trump as he tries to negotiate this peace. I mean, what are the concerns that you think France or Germany could introduce to the problem?
I don't know. I think they are so hamstrung by their own domestic political problems that I think it could go either way. And there are much smarter people than I at the Quincy Institute that have been talking about this for a long time, that this might come down to the point where Germany and France particularly, they're the two powerhouses. They need to work together and they're leading Europe. Both of them are looking at a disintegration of their governments right now. In Germany, their governing coalition collapsed.
Scholz is dead,
right? And then in France, that government literally collapsed. And I mean,
Macron's just
on a
dead man walking.
Dead man walking. And a lot of this, you know, and you can't blame all of it on war. But if you look at exit polls, if you look at what parties, particularly in Germany, that have risen in popularity, they're the ones who have been speaking out against the Ukraine war. And it's not just the far right, like AfD, but also this new leftist group, leftist party that is more populist.
You have a bunch of Greens in Germany walking around saying like, I don't understand how the perpetuation of the Ukrainian conflict is at all good for the the vote, the issue profile that I was voting for the Green Party on, right?
Right, and it's not just it's not just an anti-war argument. It's an economic argument. And Germany, their manufacturing base is imploded. And so they're being asked to give all these weapons to Ukraine. They're asked to create and build all of these new weapons to Ukraine. At the same time, the energy crisis there has made it impossible for these factories to stay open. And so you have a situation where the economy is the main issue, but the driver of the collapse of the economy, in part, is the war and the sanctions that they had put on Russia and the blowback and the energy situation as a result. And so the thread is the war. And it's the same thing in France with maybe, different dynamics, but energy is everything. And when you slapped the heaviest sanctions you could possibly slap on Russia in the history of the world, the blowback was the energy. And then the two pipelines, the Nord Stream pipelines going offline. I mean, there was a massive disruption. And so as much as I think European establishments would love to see the Ukraine war fought to the last Ukrainian, I think the people are going to be the ones that rise up and say, enough is enough. We can't do anymore. We have to start looking back inward. And anybody that you talk to will tell you that the establishments over there are worse than they are here. They're monochrome. that they don't allow for dissent. Everything's they're like in ivory towers. So, they're putting, like moving people around like chess pieces in Ukraine. I think that might come crashing down at some point. And you see the same thing happening in the United States with different dynamics. But with somebody like Donald Trump, with everything against him going into this election, for him to come out victorious and with such a mandate tells you that the people are not happy. And it's not all about Ukraine or Gaza. But that's it. They're thread lines that run under, because people say, listen, we need enough money to pay for our kids' education and for like the basic necessities and to put money in the bank and for healthcare and to take care of our elderly parents. Why are we sending money over there? Why are we sending all of our weapons there? And by the way, if we're depleting these stockpiles, what are we going to do if we really do have a national security crisis? What happens if that pivot to China turns into like a military confrontation? Right now, they could kick our butt. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not completely sure of that. But the people that I've talked to, they've been watching all the missile transfers.
The war games have said if we get into a spat in the South China Sea, it's going to go bad for us.
And it'll go bad for them too.
And they're not going to. Yeah, it'll go bad for them too. But they're not our potential confrontation with China isn't like China's making an advance on Hawaii, right? Like the confrontation with China is China's going to try to do something about the Taiwan situation, and we are going to have a very far extended presence into the region where China will be playing on its home turf, and we will have depleted stockpiles.
And just keep in mind, those war games that everybody always talks about, they all occurred before the Middle East crisis that we're seeing today. Mm-hmm. It occurred before we were expending billions of dollars worth of our missiles fighting the Houthis in the Red Sea, and then sending all of these weapons that we had already been sending over to Ukraine to Israel and depleting our stockpile. So like we're running out. Like I interviewed retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis about this. And he's like, listen, Kelley, he's like, I don't know if we could fight the Chinese at this point because we've given all of our missiles away. Now, that's an oversimplification, but I've also, commissioned some stories for Responsible Statecraft by people who watch this in a day, and they take note of all the transfers and the available open source information. And we can't make missiles as fast as we're giving them away. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of money that we're giving to defense contractors, and they got all the contracts, but a lot of these things won't be ready for another 5-10 years to replenish what we've given away. Yeah. And so what have we done to our own national security? So if you just look at a pure national interest angle, we need to stop these wars because we're making ourselves vulnerable in the effort to try to change the world and fix things overseas that to many Americans they don't know what the connection is. Mm-hmm. You take anybody off the street and they say, well, why should we have 900 troops in Syria right now? They'd be like, I don't know, maybe something to do with ISIS. Like it's vague, it's slippery. And then they look and they go, oh, okay, but I can't afford this, I can't afford to keep my mother in, a nursing home right now. She's going to have to come home and I'll have to take care of her. I'm like, but we can send $61 billion to Ukraine in April,
Yeah. And I think this is where it all kind of comes together. We talk about the economic undercurrents, right? Like the economic situation in Europe isn't that bad if energy prices remain low. Instead, we decide to fight a war against Russia, energy prices skyrocketed. Similar situation in the United States. And now we've imposed sanctions on a regime where the major nodes of that regime that we wanted to attack with the sanctions were already sanction-proofed from what happened in Crimea previously. So now you've just created more chaos for the Russian government. Should that be the goal, to create chaos for the Russian populace? I tend to think that's probably not the best idea. I tend to think that probably Russia is a long-lasting civilization, and it will continue well beyond Vladimir Putin. Just depending on the form, the form could be very different in the future, whether that's Washington regime change, which I hope does not come to pass, or whatever happens after Vladimir Putin exits the political scene. But all that is to say, Russia has certainly been weakened by this war in Ukraine, though its capacities vastly outpace Ukraine's, though its capacities will likely mean a very favorable settlement in that conflict if Donald Trump is able to broker one. But as we saw in Syria, right, that weakened Russia means that there was not enough to go around to support the Assad regime. Similar thing can be said for the Iranians. The Iranians had to focus their resources on their regional proxies surrounding Israel and the fight with Israel itself, and was not supporting the Assad regime. And so now, for those of you who have not been paying much attention to what's going on in Syria, the Bashar al-Assad regime has fallen after 50 years of the Assad family being in control. It was a quick sally from rebel forces, and I hate the Star Warsification of this conflict, where rebels, who are these rebels? Yeah. There's 8 zillion different small rebel groups that have kind of coalesced into different camps. So you had HTS, which is located in the northwest of the country, as well as Syrian rebel groups coalesced kind of under Turkish support. They surged from the north into the south, taking Hama, taking Aleppo, and eventually made their way into Damascus. The SDF, supported by the United States government, is actually a Kurdish group that the United States has designated as a terrorist organization, but that hasn't stopped us from backing them in their efforts to kind of play Turkey and Russia and the Assad regime kind of all against each other. And then, of course, in the south, there are other rebels that the United States have backed that ended up meeting HTS in Damascus. So that is
You've explained that quite well. I'm very impressed.
Thank you. That is a very long way of saying there's a lot of crazy militant Islamic groups in Syria that are now going to be tasked with running the Syrian government, essentially. And what we learned, I think, what I tried to learn from the Iraq War, is that Saddam Hussein was keeping a lid on a massive dumpster fire. And I think you could easily see a massive dumpster fire in Syria that extends to the conflict you have in the broader Middle East with Israel and the Iranian proxies, and also could tie the Ukrainian war to the conflicts happening in the Middle East right now. Why? Because the Ukrainians are already trying to tie that conflict to what's happening in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have sent kamikaze drones to some of these rebels to strike Russian military installations because the Russians were obviously pro-Assad. Tell us how this cluster bleep could really get out of hand quickly, and how this could kind of create everyone's going to avoid calling it World War III, but it could very well be World War III.
It could be a World War III, because everything you just described just set it off with a match. And then bring in the Israelis as well, because as soon as Assad fell, the Israelis took over the buffer zone between the Golan Heights and Syria, that's disputed area that had been managed or monitored by the UN. The Israelis had been sort of encroaching on that all the way up until last week. And then Sunday, they just basically took it over, and then took over a mountaintop. So they have a strategic advantage. And so at any time that could set off, then you, like you mentioned, the Turks and the Kurds. And then where does that leave us? Do we abandon our Kurdish friends, or do we side with our Turkish NATO ally? What happens to the oil fields? What if any number of these groups decide now that they want the United States out, and they want the Israelis out? They want all foreign forces, which I think at some point one of these rebel opposition groups said something to that effect. We want all foreign forces out. Well, that would mean conflict with U.S. troops. There's only 900 there, which means there are not enough U.S. troops to actually fight on the ground. Yes, we have airstrikes, which we have been striking for at least 24 hours now.
We've been targeting what are
ISIS.
ostensibly ISIS positions, but to just
That could go
to
haywire
just
too.
back into this, right? Like the leader of HTS is a former al-Nusra,
Yes.
which was an offshoot in that region of Al-Qaeda, which also worked with ISIS. And the reason that Gilani broke away from his terrorist past, quote unquote, was because Baghdadi, when he was still alive, wanted to consolidate al-Nusra and ISIS in the region into ISIS of Syria and the Levant. And so there's like inter-jihadi,
Right, exactly.
not only the interfaith between Shia and Sunni, there's inter-jihadi conflicts. And so now like the US government is saying we're striking ISIS only targets. Well, does that mean that you're like striking HTS? Because a lot of those fighters are
Exactly.
like affiliated with ISIS
Right.
in their past. So anyway, it just
Yeah,
all very
it
convoluted.
goes on and on. Also, Israel is also striking targets in Damascus because they said they want to take out the chemical weapons depots there. There are a lot of foreign airstrikes and foreign military incursions happening right now. This all leads me to say that Donald Trump is right. We need to get out of there. This doesn't involve us. Our troops are sitting ducks, and we can't explain to the American people why we're there. If we can't do that, we need to get out. I guess the biggest argument that I can imagine somebody in the blob saying to me right now is that we got to keep ISIS in check. Well, that's always been the argument. And no matter, it depends on who you talk to. 1 minute, oh, we've taken care of the ISIS problem. Then why are we still there? Oh, because we got an ISIS problem. It's coming up again. And this has gone back and forth for 10 years now. And my gut is that we spent more time fighting Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Iraq than we have ISIS. I think ISIS is pretty well in check.
Well, and ISIS was kind of isolated. The territorial holdings
yes.
it had was isolated to kind of the east of the country and kind of like the southern
creating any caliphate anymore.
Yeah, the southeastern region, and the Assad government and the Russian government working together to kill him.
Right.
So I think Trump's perspective has been, what are we doing here?
What
Let's
are we
get
doing
the heck
here?
out.
Let's get out. And he tried to during his first administration.
And he was rebuffed,
Right.
not only by members of his own administration, but by members of Congress.
Yes.
We saw this effort come up last Congress. Matt Gaetz tried to lead a
Yep.
group of lawmakers to get out of Syria, and they were met with absolute condemnation from establishment figures on both sides of the aisle. Why does the legislature, the Republican, Democrat, uniparty establishment in the legislature, think we should have troops in Syria? Like, do they just not care at this point?
But this is the blob. This is a self-sustaining. They call it a self-licking ice cream cone. There really isn't any logic to it. It's like, well, they're there. They need to be doing something. And if we call them back, if we retrench, somehow we're losing some power. We're losing some budget. We're losing some part of the fiefdom. And so I think it's this strange Borg logic in Washington that anytime that we talk about retrenching or taking back or cutting a budget, that somehow that means a loss of power. That's a bad thing. And so everybody just goes rushing to battle stations to keep the troops there, and they'll use any excuse to keep them there. I feel like Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Rand Paul, Tom Massey, Matt Gaetz, a lot of these guys cut through all that BS and said, no, you can't explain to me why it's in our national interest for those troops to be there. So we're calling to bring them back. And they, of course, they've been met by the blob. And you're actually right. It is a uniparty. And whatever you think of Matt Gaetz, he was one of the few Republican members outside of Senator Paul who would advance these bills to get our troops home, whether it was in Syria or Somalia and these other places where we seem to be still fighting the 9/11 wars. And he did team up with Democrats like Ilhan Omar. He wasn't afraid to say, let's all get on the same page. The rare moments of reaching, across the aisle and disregarding the partisanship. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. But I don't really have a good answer for you in terms of like why they want to keep us there. I just think it's a territorial thing. It's a blob thing. It's a group think. Nobody wants to be like, for the Democrats, they don't want to be seen as weak. So Republicans can always use that against them. What, you want to bring troops home? That means ISIS is going to take over. What are you, friendly with terrorists? Like they use those rhetorical devices. And on the other hand, it's like, I feel like Republicans feel like they really buy into this idea that we have to have this military deterrence, even if it's just 900 troops and airstrikes, that by reducing that, somehow that shows weakness.
And as if we haven't been doing most of this with over-the-horizon capabilities in the first place.
Right. We we have enough bases in the region.
Mm-hmm. My last question for you is, as I look at the Syria situation, is this the end of the beginning of the Syrian civil war? Is this going to, are we going to look back at the years 2014 to 2024 as just the beginning of a much longer, much bloodier conflict in that country?
I'm not that smart. I mean, on one hand, I could say this is the beginning of a much bloodier conflict because of everything that you talked about in terms of all of these disparate groups. They're all out there and they're all going to be fighting for power and a piece of territory, of power, of authority over those poor people who have suffered enough since 2011 and in the Civil War. And what makes me nervous is to see the blob somehow mobilizing behind this narrative that there is this moment of democracy happening, just the same words and language that we heard in Libya when we intervened there and bombed them and killed Gaddafi. When we toppled Saddam Hussein, there was this moment of like, wow, these people are finally getting their moment. And I would love to see the people of Syria be able to get out from under the brutality of Assad, but I don't want to see that become under the brutality of some theocracy that looks no different than what we see in Afghanistan today with the Taliban. And it makes me nervous when these narratives are built up in the mainstream media, and we're supposed to believe that HTS is somehow rebranded to be more moderate, and they're letting Christians put up Christmas trees, and they're not like cracking down on women who aren't all fully covered up. And this seems like another Western manipulated, confected story to make us all feel better about what we're seeing on the television right now. And I think I've been around too long to know that's usually some sort of signal or warning that the opposite is going to happen. Now, does that sound paranoid? Maybe. But like I said, there are people that are much smarter than me that they're saying, hold on. There's too many groups here that are in competition. And you took Assad out of the equation. He was weakening. This guy was finished. But like you said, it was holding a lid on something. Now, whether it's a pressure cooker and it's all going to blow, or it'll simmer and we might not see anything really blow for a couple years, I don't know. But I feel like all of the foreign interests, like we talked about, the U.S., Turkey, Israel, Russia. Now, Russia, I think, is just getting out of there. But I feel like when you have you have these motivations coming in from the outside. I think we better put the seatbelts on because things are going to happen, and as quickly maybe or not than it has in the last week.
Well, the world's over the past 4 years, it's gotten a lot more complicated, and we hope and pray that it doesn't become a whole lot more bloodier.
Yeah.
So, Kelley Vlahos, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much
on the Signal Sitdown.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.